We are today here to discuss a big, little, wonderful book, in fact, a very challenging one, Feline Philosophy, The Cats and the Meaning of Life. I will show you the Romanian version of this book. This author is John Gray, a British political philosopher, interested in history of ideas. He was a teacher to London School of Economics, Oxford, Harvard, Yale. In fact, John Gray contributes regularly to the New Statesman, The Guardian, and the Times Literary Supplement, who wrote a lot of books, but this one is the first one to be translated into Romanian. The most important thing, it's of course the fact that you are here with us today. Be welcomed.
And thank you very much for publishing my book and for arranging this wonderful event. Thank you very much. It's
a big pleasure to read your books and to listen to your presentation, in fact. I will tell a story. Before all that, our host today is Cărturești. This is a absolutely wonderful bookstore. It's one of the finest and the most spectacular bookstore in Europe. In fact, they are not only a bookstore. It's not only a place where you can find books. You can find them, you can read them, but also you can discuss, you can meet people, you can meditate, you can eat, which is very important.
Yes.
What I wanted to say is that they invented a real way to be happier, to a way of tasting the good life. I wanted to tell you there because they are celebrating 20 years of existence, and they absolutely wanted to invite you and to discuss these books, Feline Philosophy, today.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I thank them as well as you. Then I'm enormously grateful and proud to be part of their bookstore, as well as talking to you and the others present now.
Let's start our dialogue. In the beginning of your book, Feline Philosophy, your book you have written for human readers, in fact, you said the following thing.
I'm not clever enough to do one for cats. Thank you.
So I quote you: "Cats have no need of philosophy. The human animal never ceases striving to be something that it's not. Cats make no such effort. Much of human life is a struggle for happiness, not cats. In fact, it seems that cats are wiser than humans. It seems that they are even wiser than philosophers. They know better than us what a good life means. How is that possible?"
Cats are especially wiser than philosophers. I think I'm not convinced that philosophers are wiser than human beings who've never done philosophy. In other words, as I say in the book, I don't accept the Socratic claim that a life which is a human life, which is not philosophically self-examined, is a life that's not worth living. Most human beings who've ever lived have not been philosophers or practiced philosophy or even known anything much about philosophy. And yet I think many human beings have lived worthwhile lives, worthwhile to themselves and to the other human beings, and even the cats that they interact with. So one of the targets of my book is the idea that wisdom comes from thinking, especially the kind of thinking that philosophers do. Now, there are many types of philosophical thinking. There are many types of philosophical traditions, but in pretty much all of them, especially in the Western tradition, going back to the Greeks, there's a project whereby it's believed that by somehow uncovering, exposing, or revealing truths about human life, one can live better than one would live if one hadn't done philosophy. And one of my, a writer, not a philosopher, who influenced me greatly, who led my doubts on this question to crystallize and become stronger, is the Polish writer who wrote in English, Joseph Conrad. And one of the interesting things about him as a writer is that he wasn't a writer any more than I am now, a philosopher in a professional or academic sense. He spent 20 or 30 years of his life as a seaman, as a sailor. And in some of his wonderful letters, he writes to correspondents. Many correspondents say, one of his favorite correspondents says, when you portray this character, you don't give him any philosophical views. He doesn't ask any philosophical questions. He doesn't have any general ideas about the world. And Conrad replies, he knows how to live already, like cats do perhaps, except that the human being has to learn how to live. And in Conrad's idea, or Conrad's reply, he suggests that the human being acquired the skills and the practices of being a seaman, which included being strong and calm, even in situations that were dangerous, or even in situations that were hopeless. So someone who has those practices and attitudes and abilities can live well, lives well. And philosophizing wouldn't improve them. It could even damage them, because it could, so to speak, dissolve the habits and practices that they've already got. The difference with a cat is a cat knows by nature how to live. It doesn't even have to copy. Maybe it learns from its mother, or how to hunt, or is guided in some kinds of ways. But most of the habits and practices and of cats, of felines, are inborn. Now, the central paradox in my book, and the central problem in my book, if you like, or the central question is, if cats can live like this and be happy like this, can we learn from them? Can we learn from them to live more happily or less unhappily ourselves? And one of my answers is actually no, because humans by nature seem to reject their own nature. They don't want to be mortal. They are mortal, but they don't want to be mortal. They're limited in countless ways by their bodies. They don't want to be limited by their bodies. They find their body very often a kind of a burden. They regret what they do in their lives, but they also regret all that they haven't done. However they live, they seem to be full of regrets. Cats have no regrets. Very hard to find in cat behavior a sign of regret. And it's very hard to find in cat behavior anything like a cat wanting to be other than the cat it is. It is the cat it is. Humans, all of us, nearly all of us, or perhaps even every single human being, wants to be somewhat different from what they are. They want a life different from the one they've lived and the one they expect to live. They're terrified of missing out from the opportunities of life, even if they're, or especially if they're atheists, or as I am myself, unbelievers, because the advantage of belief for humans, and one of the reasons they invent religions, I think, is to carry on the story of their lives beyond bodily death, beyond the grave. Because one of the dangers of being a human is that you find the meaning of your life in a story, which you construct for yourselves or someone invents for you and you accept. And once you identify with the story, your life is full of anxiety about the story suddenly stopping or changing or being destroyed, as it often is by life, by bad things like wars, revolutions, tyrannies, economic collapses, illnesses. But sometimes it can be suddenly changed by good things. You suddenly fall in love with another human being, or with a non-human being. You see beauty where you haven't noticed it before. Something happens to you which is not in your story, and you're better. But most of the time you live more, your life is illuminated. But most of the time humans cling to their stories desperately, in desperation, because once the story goes, the meaning goes. And so the central question in my book is, given that we can't be cats, humans reject their natures by nature. That's the paradox, I think, of humans. Cats don't have religions. They don't have philosophies, as we've just said. They don't try to change the world. even the feline world. They don't try and change themselves, any of these things. If you've ever seen photographs of cats on some of these Greek islands during the day, or hundreds of them stretched out as the sun goes down, they're not thinking to themselves, I wish it had gone down earlier, or I wish it didn't go down like this every night, it's boring. They're not thinking any of those things. They're sitting, watching the sun go down. Now, the problem with humans is we can't do that. So in what way can we learn from cats? Someone might say, the conclusion of your book is you can't learn anything from cats, except that they're so different from us and maybe happier, but we can't. However, I think we can learn some things. Since part of their happiness is not telling their lives as stories, maybe we can be less attached to our stories. Because if you're attached to your story, you're inevitably attached to your suffering, because most of the stories break down. All do, actually, over time, because we all die. Then they all break down, unless you're religious. So that's one small lesson that we can perhaps take from cats.
Let me introduce now our new speaker, Laurențiu Staicu. We started the same university at the same time. We were students in philosophy. After getting our PhD, in fact, we choose different paths. Laurențiu Staicu is a teacher at the university, and he's vice dean of the faculty, department of philosophy. As for me, I embrace the passion of publishing that brings us together now, because Trei Publishing House is not only John Gray's publisher, but we also publish 2 books written by Laurențiu, and I warmly recommend to our readers the last one, Socrate's in Jeans, Philosophy for Teenagers, which is wonderful. Another thing that brings us together, besides philosophy, it's of course cats, because I think that all of them we have and we love them. Don't forget, I have one of them here with me. So, John Gray, let me introduce Laurențiu.
Thank you, Magda. We already met before, and we got a chance to talk about cats and philosophy. But I'm very glad, as I said previously, I'm very glad to meet you, Professor Gray, and to be able to discuss with you as the author of this wonderful book about cats and about human nature. You know, I have to confess, for me, your book was somehow like an ambush, you know, a literary ambush. At first glance, it seems, and it seemed to me, a very optimistic read, at least from the title, right? And also from the cover, as you saw, at least in its Romanian version, it looks very nice and light. It promises to be a light read.
It's short. Actually, it's very short, for one thing.
Well, it's short, right? But it's not light. When I first saw it, I was like, you know, wow, here's a book about cats written by a philosopher. It should be a joyride. But after reading a few pages, I discovered it is actually very pessimistic for us as human beings. I got that somber feeling up until the end of the book, because it seems, as you said before, it seems that we are actually doomed, we human beings, because we cannot escape what we're doing, which is a futile attempt to go somehow beyond our mortal nature and to find immortality in those illusions of our own mind. Perfect love, perfect morality, perfect happiness,
perfect society,
and so on. Perfect society, exactly. And in short, we don't seem to be able to accept what and who we are. Is that correct, or I'm just putting my thoughts into it? Is that
no?
an idea?
That it is correct. It's one of the fundamental themes of the book. How far this is, in some degree, it's humanly universal. One of the problems I've written about in my earlier books, which is also appears in this book, is that history is largely made by the people who are most unhappy with being humans. History. I mean, there are countless human beings who are living their lives, getting married, having children, working in jobs. They may or may not be religious. They go to church, they pray, they come back, or they don't go to church. They just live as they are. There are countless human beings in whom this impulse of violent self-transcendence is weak. There are, however, a minority of humans who, in certain historical circumstances of disorder and chaos, can attract large human audiences who are so unhappy with being human, or in some cases, they think they're already more than human, the tyrants and charismatic leaders of politics and religion, that they make history, and much of history is a nightmare. Someone once objected to, I gave a talk about cats, and someone had got up and spoke and said, but cats have no history. And I said, you see that as a disadvantage? Is it? Because much of human history, maybe the history of art is beautiful, maybe the history of literature, or even the history of philosophy maybe have certain beauties, but most of actual lived history is difficult or even nightmarish. So it is, in that sense, a pessimistic book. And I'm often accused of being excessively pessimistic. But on the other hand, it's a book whose conclusions would not surprise many people before the modern period. If you thought of the Buddha or Confucius or Lao Tzu, or even some of the Greek philosophers, Pyrrho, Aristotle, they never assumed that human life could be completely transformed. They might have had ideas, as Plato and Christianity and Aristotle and the Stoics and the others, they might have had ideas about changing their own lives internally, somehow ordering their soul. They might have had ideas. They did have ideas about that, but it never occurred to them that the nature of human life as it had been lived up to that point could change completely. And that, I think, is a modern idea. I think it's a kind of fusion of certain old religious and mystical traditions with the modern idea that humans can make themselves, that if we're unhappy with ourselves, we don't have to be unhappy with ourselves. We can change ourselves. We can become something completely different from ourselves. So compared with that view, it is pessimistic. But from another point of view, it's not pessimistic, because I point not only to cats, who I think have lived well. There are some stories in the book, some of them true factual stories, such as the Vietnamese cat Meow, who lived—
wonderful story, yeah.
True story, yes, who lived through, as a kitten, the nightmare of the Vietnam War, was adopted by an American newspaper man, and then famous television personality of the period, was taken to Saigon and then to America and then to London, and eventually died, but at a reasonable age for a cat, I think about 13 or 14, from the English weather. That was what got him in the end. But a heroic cat, a fearless cat, a wonderful cat, but also human beings. And one of the human beings I talk about in the book, is Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist and writer, who I think lived in a dangerous time, difficult time. But I think from what we can read, was happy, and he attributed his happiness to accepting that he was human in all the ways that most human beings don't want to be human. He accepted that he would die. He accepted that there were many things he would never know, that his knowledge was very limited. And he also accepted that philosophy couldn't substantially change him, And he has a rather nice observation. He says, look at a cat walking on a tiny rope across between two buildings. Does it stand beforehand and think, how do I do this? What principles do I apply? Which is the best theory? If it did, it would step and then fall into the abyss. It just crosses. Now, he doesn't say humans can be like that. One of the examples he gives of his own unhappiness is he had a great friend who died, and Etienne de la Boétie, I think it was. Anyway, that doesn't matter. He had a great friend who died, and he was in deep melancholy for a while. He asked himself, what can I do? And he said, what I did was I relied upon my own nature, but I applied a little art. I encouraged myself to fall in love with someone else. So a human art. And without losing the love I had from my friend who died, I carried on living in a happy way. So I guess what I suggest in the book is that the human attempt to transcend being human is one of the chief sources of human unhappiness. So if we could surrender that, instead of trying to conquer the fear of death, be afraid. Just be afraid. And over time, Montaigne says, the fears will somewhat dissipate. Nature will take over. And if it doesn't take over, take up a religion. Go to, take up the ways, the arts that humans have developed for that. Now, just one for if it seems like an ambush for you, maybe one reason is you think that the message of the book is that we shouldn't do philosophy, but that's not the message of the book, because you can't stop, human beings can't stop, even human beings who've never read any book of philosophy, who've never heard of philosophy, don't know anything, can't stop being influenced by philosophical ideas because they're in our language, they're in our everyday life, they're buried, they've sunk in deeply into our language. We have them whether we like it or not. So the kind of philosophy that I sort of recommend, and that Montaigne recommended, was what you might call homeopathic philosophy. That's to say, philosophy which tries to undo the harms that philosophy does. And Wittgenstein talked a bit like that in some of his later work. So it's not that we shouldn't do philosophy. There's nothing more dangerous than someone who thinks they're living naturally when in fact they're living according to some bad philosophy. And the only way we can discover that is by doing some philosophy and finding. So it's not that we shouldn't do it. It's not that we should tell teenagers, don't do philosophy, it's all rubbish. So do philosophy, because then you can find out how much you're influenced by philosophy.
So
I totally agree with you.
We seem damnated. Even the philosophy help us in homeopathic ratio. We cannot bear too much. In fact, I have a question. It's an obvious one. Cats embrace their nature. Humans not. This is the problem. Cats obeys easily their nature. Instead, the humans are all the time discontent with their nature. How can I understand this nature? I am born with it. I am acquiring it during my lifetime. Is it given to me? I am the creator. It's the creation of someone, of the hazard of my creation, my own destiny. In fact, my question is, if we have a nature, and this is the nature we possess, are we still responsible?
I guess there may be, I see possibly two questions in what you've asked, which is, one is, why are humans discordant animals, discordant creatures, when other animals are not, especially cats? And the speculation I advance in the book is that humans, alone among the animals, have discovered death in their own lives, have discovered their own mortality. And we can even trace this back to 50 or 100,000 years ago, when humans started burying themselves and each other and talking about an afterlife. So I think it's that discovery. I mean, some animals, elephants and others, seem to know that something has happened to one of their fellow animals when they die or become dead. They gather around it. But I don't think there's any evidence that other animals have a continuous sense of their own mortality. So that's something humans discovered in the course of their biological history, and that each of us discovers in the course of their individual lives. Because if you're young, you might accept as a scientific fact that you are, or empirical fact that you're mortal, but you don't feel mortal very much. You only feel it when others that you've known and had close relationships die. But your question is a slightly different question. Your question is, if we just have a kind of nature which is given to us, how can we be responsible? Which I guess it's a question about free will. Is that a question about freedom of will? That whether we're responsible for how we live our lives, or that we can change our lives? That whether we have free will. It's hard for us. I don't know if this is a strictly universal, an anthropologically universal truth, but it's hard to avoid the sense that we're taking decisions. It's hard to avoid the sense that the feeling, if you like, that we're taking decisions. It may be that a sense of being free, a sense of taking decisions, a sense of shaping our life is a universal human illusion, or it may be that it's not universal. I sometimes wonder about the pre-philosophical Greeks, the Homeric Greeks. Did they feel that they were choosing selves, struggling, sometimes tragically, to shape their lives? Or did they sometimes feel that their lives were shaped by parts of themselves? They had ideas such as a daimon, a kind of supernatural or non-natural entity, which sometimes entered into them and caused them to live in one way rather than another. I'm not sure whether the feeling of or the sense or the illusion even of free will is anthropologically universal, or whether it's culture bound, whether it's something that we've developed in the last few thousand years in certain parts of the world. It's certainly universal in the sense of questions are asked about free will. For example, if you go back to the Buddha 500 years before the Christian period, one of his questioners is reported as asking, "You believe in universal cause and effect, karma, don't you?" And the Buddha says, "Yes." And the questioner asks, "But then how can we free ourselves from this if we're already controlled by it?" And the Buddha says, "You're thinking too much. Just meditate. Don't bother yourself with these metaphysical questions. If you feel unhappy, adopt some of the meditation practices that I recommend, and you might be less unhappy." And so I don't think the question of free will is essential in other philosophical and religious traditions outside of the West. It may exist, it may pop up now and then, but we've made it central, and maybe that's one of the shadows or one of the inheritances from theism, because actually, one of the things about Jewish and Christian theism, which contrasts with Greek thought, different from Greek philosophy, is that God is supposed to have created the world freely as an act of freedom. God needn't have created the world, just did it, created the world, created each of us, gave each of us souls. That was God who did it. And gradually over time, I think we formed an image of humanity, even of ourselves, in which we can create things, even perhaps create our own lives, even make our lives, so to speak, works of art. I think that is partly an illusion, and even a dangerous illusion. I guess your question is, if free will is an illusion, is it a good illusion or a bad illusion? Does it help us or damage us?
Both. Stories, it seems to be bad, but at the same time, I think that it's
Why do you
vital.
think it's bad? Yes, you think it's bad?
It seems to be bad, but I think that it's good. Like stories, you
Yes,
are telling about people are unhappy because they are creating stories, and they fit to these stories. As soon as the stories break out, they are unhappy. But I think that we are being of stories, and I think that this is so one of the most essential
Stories.
Vital energy that we have, telling stories. And because telling stories is not telling one story, it's telling many stories.
Yes.
And disrupting from one to another and avoiding to be tyrants inside a prison.
Some of the unhappiest people are people whose story has broken down and they can't tell a new story. And I have friends who are psychoanalysts, and one of them said, all I promise my clients is another way or several other ways of telling the story of their life. That if the psychoanalysis works, which he says it often doesn't, then they'll have a different set of, maybe one different story or two different stories of looking at their lives, and that may enable them to live better. But this is, of course, a deep thing you've just said, which is that, of course, I think all really good things, all things that are really good, have badness as a shadow. Nearly all good things are intermixed, admixed with bad things. And that sort of rather goes against a certain tradition in Christianity, because God is supposed to have all the good things without any of the bad things. And even it goes against Aristotle, I think, in some ways, because Aristotle believed in the unity of the good, of the virtues, or Plato, the form of the good. All the goods could all sort of mingle in and become a perfect good. Whereas one of the ideas I'm attacking in the book, in a kind of subterranean ambush of the kind that is perfection. Not that we're all imperfect. That's not my argument. Everyone thinks it is, because they don't read, except you have, but others haven't. I'm attacking the very idea of perfection. It's not that we can't achieve perfection. We can't even imagine it or conceive it. Can you imagine a human being who's extremely bold and ambitious and risk-taking and courageous, but very meek and gentle and cautious and prudent? I don't think we can. The human virtues and human goods. Can we imagine someone who loved very, very profoundly, very, very passionately, but if the love suddenly ended, just forgot about it the next day? We can't imagine that. So it's the very one things I think about cats is, just as they don't have an idea of a different life that they've missed living, they don't regret the lives that they haven't lived. They've only got the life they do live. They don't have an idea of a perfect life. And I think the idea of a perfect life, the life you would most like to lead, is a burden, and that you're happier if you drop it.
Laurențiu?
But isn't that the price we have to pay for being who we are? I mean, I totally agree with you. We build a story about ourselves, and we try to refine it to make it better and better. And society, of course, always encourages us to do just that, right? To strive to achieve something more, a life project, which is unique and special, to always have a purpose. Now, do you think we could get rid of that imperative or command and still be what we are? Is progress, which could be seen, I guess, as the end result of this imperative to live according to some higher purpose. Is progress something that we should abandon once and for all? What do you think of that?
Well, I just begin by one question, which is it true that human beings have always thought of their lives as projects? I doubt it. I've known many people in my life.
Yeah.
I grew up in a northeastern working class community in the 1940s, 50s. Some people thought of their lives as projects. I did for a while, and left and became soldiers or sailors. I became a university teacher, but most did not. They lived the lives that were given them. And some of them were very good lives. They were brave. They were rich lives. They did many things. Wars came. They lived through the war. They lost. They built again. They were good lives, many good lives, but they weren't projects. I think the idea of human life as a project is probably quite recent. It's probably, of course, connected in our traditions with Christian and other ideas of redemption, that there's something wrong with the life we naturally live, something encrypted in being a human being, which is bad or evil, so that we have to redeem it. But many people, I don't think, have that idea. But I think the idea of progress more generally, as we have it now, and you're talking about it, I think rightly, as it applies in individual lives, as well as in, or more than in society. Can we do without it? Well, I think, especially in times, in periods of history that are extremely fluid, as perhaps ours is. I mean, you might say they're always fluid, but sometimes they're more fluid than others. Ours is fluid partly because of technology. This technology that we're using wasn't really, wouldn't have done this 20 years ago. We couldn't have done it. Now it's become natural almost. But there are many other reasons why it's fluid. I think the idea of internal progress within the individual human being can be damaging, because one of the things that it carries with it, the idea of progress is not that things can get better. Things obviously are better or worse, and so on. We can make comparative judgments in our own lives and even in periods of history. Certainly within Europe and in communist Europe, in which Romanians live, things are better than they were in many respects, I think, than they were at the worst periods. But the idea of progress isn't the idea. The idea of progress is that betterment or improvement can be cumulative over long periods. It's the idea that what you have gained or built or acquired, you can keep and then build on it. And in the trouble with that idea is that it's not true. And while I'm friendly to many illusions, I think this illusion can be burdensome or it's not true, because many of the features of society which are good and which people think correctly are good are regarded by them as fixed. So there is a kind of model, a simple primitive model. You might say almost a kind of bourgeois, I don't use it in the Marxist sense, but a bourgeois model, which is, well, we've achieved democracy, we've reformed prisons somewhat. Well, now we can do these other things. We can move on to further projects of progress. The assumption is that those features of society, like democracy or a certain level of freedom or rule of law, are fixed. They can vanish in an instant. Yeah. They can vanish in a week or a month or a day or a year and be gone then for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 generations. We learned that from the Russian Revolution, not that Tsarism was ideal in any way, but we can learn it from China, we can learn it from Romania, we can learn it from, I think it applies to every human society. It could apply in my society. It hasn't for a long time. The Civil War was several hundred years, but it can apply at any time. And certainly many of the restrictions on freedom, practical freedom that exists now in my society, on freedom of speech, for example, didn't exist 20 years ago. 20 years ago or 40 years ago, when I studied with and talked with Isaiah Berlin in Oxford, or the idea that academics could be criticized or attacked or punished or even driven out of their jobs for saying things was unthinkable. The idea was this was fixed. We'd achieved this, it wouldn't go away. It in a sense always goes away at some point in the course of history. So what's dangerous politically, I'll come to psychology in a moment. What's dangerous politically is the idea that these the achievements that have been made at any one point in history are fixed and permanent. They're absolutely never fixed and permanent. And they can actually break down in such a way that further progress is possible. One of the most common cliches is, well, progress is always possible. It isn't. I'll give you an example. I'm sure it's one you've thought of yourself. After the First World War in Central Europe, the bourgeois society that existed before was destroyed. The middle classes were destroyed by inflation, the workers by unemployment. New political movements emerged, radical nationalism, Nazism, fascism, and of course, communism. And one of the reasons that certainly the kind of progress that believers in progress, imagine they say progress is incremental, we go step by step, but it assumes that the previous steps stay strong, stay there, exist. It assumes that as you go up the ladder, each rung that you stepped on is still there. But supposing as you go up, some of them fall off, or all of them, which is what happened in Central Europe. So progress in the sense, in a social or political sense, requires enough consensus on values and objectives to make compromises, to move together. In Central Europe and many European countries after the First World War, there wasn't such progress. Wittgenstein puts that somewhere as a general statement. He says disagreement presupposes agreement. You have to have some values, some meanings, otherwise you can't understand each other. So you just, in the worst case, start fighting each other and even killing each other. And that happened in Central Europe with all the effects that we then know. So politically, I think the idea of progress, at least now, maybe it was useful in the 18th century. Many of the believers in progress in the Enlightenment, like Montesquieu, fought against torture and other evils because partly because they believed in progress. They thought we could have a world without torture. Seems that was an illusion. 20th century was full of torture. There were whole regimes founded on torture. Not that just practiced torture here and there, but were based on torture, based on the routinization of torture. Lots and lots of regimes. But so maybe in the 18th century, it was useful, that idea. It's not useful now. But what about in our inner lives? Do we really need an idea of cumulative progress? Well, it leads to the paradox, which is that, or the difficulty, which is hard to overcome, which is that if our lives are progressive projects in which what we achieve in one period goes on to the next period, well, there's always the fact of death. It would seem that there's not much progress beyond that, unless you believe that it, by the way, I wrote a whole book called the Immortalization Commission about two projects of immortality, one in Edwardian England, when people even imagined that posthumous scientists would go on inventing things in the afterlife. Go on gaining knowledge. And also the project of immortality in the early Soviet Union, where it was thought that people did die forever, but they could be brought back by freezing as Lenin was, but actually frozen. So there's a problem of death, but there's also, I think, in a time of great fluidity like now, it may be very difficult for many people to frame as and burdensome and painful and unnecessarily harmful to them when their lives change suddenly all the time. I mean, migrants, refugees, their whole life changes, maybe not just once, but twice or three times. They can turn that into a story, but it may be that trying to have an overall story of one's life when things can change the way they are changing now, in which what you gain is permanent, is no longer useful. For example, all of us are now exposed to what seems to be a partly soluble problem, the COVID virus.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in previous periods of history, there have been plagues and pestilences, but we haven't had anything beyond. The last big one was influenza 100 years ago. Can we? One of the way I see this danger working is people say we've got to get back to normalcy, the way it was before COVID. I don't think we are going to get back to the way it was before COVID. We can have lots of. I've had my 3 vaccinations.
Me too.
You're good. So I'm protected as much as I can be. I wear masks still now and then and practice some cautionary things, but we've moved back to more normal life, if you like, in the sense that more things are free, but not to the life that was there before. And I think if we obsess about the life before, we say, we've got to have the kind of, we'll be permanently in, because we're not going back to, there will be less global travel in future. There will be probably more technological surveillance of our temperature when you walk into stores, or all these kind of things that are burdensome, but they're also perhaps necessary or useful. So we should get used to them, and we should explore what we can do, not say how terrible or tragic it is that we can't go back to what was there before, but take this just as a kind of a rupture. We're on the other side of a different kind of life. We tell a different story, lots of different stories. So I'm not sure that this idea, to me, a positive attitude to life means accepting life as a gift, and exploring and all that is good in it as it is given to us in our lives and in history. Of course, people don't like the idea that it's given to us by fate or history. They hate that, because the humanistic idea, not Montaigne's humanism, but the humanism we had here, we can make our lives just the way we want. One of the problems with that, by the way, is who's we? People who attend seminars? Are there not people in the world with completely different life stories? One of the great dangers in being a human being is being caught in someone else's life story without wanting to be, which is what happened on a huge scale, I think.
Yeah,
in the 20th century.
Yeah.
I was thinking of that. I was thinking that that's what happens to all of us. We are all living someone else's lives.
To some extent.
In a way.
Yes, yes.
Now,
we have to live also someone's life.
Magda, please.
At least in fiction.
But that's an interesting thing, because our lives are, in a sense, fiction that we make up.
Yes.
You see, this is going back to your earlier question. But we think of ourselves as authors, but we inherit texts.
So we are not actually authors, right? We are
plagiarists.
We are written. We are
characters.
I have a confession to make to you. I am not a cat. And because I am not a cat, I have a regret. My regret is that we have to close our session. So I would like to ask you, at the end of the book, as Laurențiu said, there is a list of 10 hints, feline hints for the human existence. I'd like to ask you to choose, each of us, one of them, which is if it were to choose one of them, which one would be? Laurențiu and John Gray also.
I'll remind myself of them. As you say, but they're hints, not commandments.
They are hints, yes.
Yeah, cats never make commandments, never issue commandments. It might be hard to pick one, but let's have a look.
This is the human destiny.
I guess the one which would be closest to our conversation, which has been a wonderful conversation, is the very last one. If you cannot learn to live a little more like a cat, return without regret to the human world of diversion.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Well, for me, as a cat owner and a cat lover, it seems the first lesson should be that of playing more.
Good. Yeah.
And be less concerned with what should be done.
Yes.
With all those imperatives.
Yes.
Which sometimes seem to be unavoidable. But I tend to agree with you. They are not unavoidable. At least in that respect, we seem to have free will. We can choose to live differently.
And often do.
Yeah. And often do, right.
Sometimes it's forced on us, but sometimes we just do from some inner, it's an inner compulsion that makes us live differently. And then, and that's good, can often be good. I think cats could understand that. They might say, if they could understand, they might say, humans are more interesting than we thought they were.
Well, you have to agree, whatever flaws we have as humans, it seems at least we did one smart thing when we accepted cats as our companions.
We did. But we also have other things. I would just say, I mean, religions and philosophies to me are like great works of art. They're like cathedrals or paintings. reproduce those. Cats don't. They don't need to. They don't want to.
Yeah.
And they can live without them. I don't think we can live without them. It's hard to live.
We cannot, yeah.
And maybe, again, shouldn't try. Or at least we shouldn't make them so fundamental in our lives that the destruction of a particular religion or philosophy or meaning wipes us out completely. That would be like loving one painting in the world and not liking any other painting.
Well, maybe the problem is cats are never bored.
They're not. That's
whereas we have that bad habit of getting bored. So maybe that's why we need to do all those things to avoid boredom.
It'd be interesting to know, I'm not enough of a scientist, but when boredom crept into the evolutionary history of humanity, I did ask a primatologist whether apes got bored. And he said, well, I've watched them looking the sun go down for hours, and it seemed they weren't at all bored. He said, but on the other hand, I watched them looking at empty brick walls for hours, and they didn't seem bored. And then he said a very interesting thing. He said, but I think some violence in chimps, certain types of chimps, is caused by boredom, which is a very interesting idea, because I think it also applies to humans. If humans are existentially bored, they tend to try to violently change their lives and other people's lives. So that's so maybe the deep ontology of the human structure is not, as I've said earlier, the flight from death, but maybe the disorder of boredom. Maybe boredom is the deepest, the most quintessentially human, even though some animals may have it to some degree. It may be the most quintessentially human attribute, and that's what we have to cope with. And there again, cats who never ever seem to experience it. Maybe if they're kept in a small state, they'll feel captive, confined. They won't enjoy. They won't like that. They'll try to get out, but they're not exactly bored. They're unfree. They want to be more free.
I want to pick my own hint if it's possible. It was difficult. It's the third one. It's very paradoxical. I don't know if it's optimistic or not. Don't look for meaning in your suffering. In fact, I am reading it. Don't stay attached to your suffering.
Well, that's a very hard saying, especially for anyone who's really suffered. As of course, many people did in Eastern Europe. Their sufferings were profound and life-breaking in many cases. But the ones I've known who, when I used to go to Eastern Europe, for example, quite a bit, the ones I've known who survived and lived on and lived new lives were not broken because they were somehow able to leave at least part of the suffering behind. And I think here's a feature which perhaps we can learn from cats. It sounds kind of maybe almost cruel, but part of the wisdom of life is forgetting. Forgetting. If you can't turn something into a story which enriches your life, it's better to forget it. And cats seem to do that naturally. So Meow forgot for most of his days, for the rest of his life, the traumatic experiences that as a little kitten Meow had experienced in Vietnam. But Meow reacted very badly to the sound of vacuum cleaners. They were somehow there. The traumatic sounds, which he maybe associated with helicopters or bombing or something like that, with terrible things, would be reawakened in him later on. So wherever he lived for a while, they had to sack the cleaner or the cleaner left by themselves because Meow would attack them, not just run away, but even attack when he was younger. But other than that, cats have the ability, which is something I think I wish Freud had written on cats. As far as I remember, he didn't. Is that they're able to forget without that turning into a repressed memory. When humans forget, or when they forget something painful, it always comes out later in some kind of symptomatic form. That's what psychoanalysis is about. And that's maybe why Freud said his goal was to enable his client, his patients, to have normal human unhappiness rather than hysterical misery. Remember, he wrote in a famous letter, he said, what's the goal of psychoanalysis? He said, the goal is to be normally unhappy and not hysterically unhappy. What we learn from cats is that they can be not normally unhappy, but actually normally happy, even if they've had earlier traumas, because unless they're near at hand, if they go on in life, they can forget the traumas most of the time, unless they're reminded of themselves. So I think it is something which one learns from cats, which is that you can endure your suffering more if you turn it into a story which is meaningful to you. The best such stories are religious. Because if you talk to a really religious person, and you say, I've got terrible suffering, they say, it's a gift. It's a gift from God. It's terrible for you, but it's teaching you something. You have to learn from it. But if one is not religious, it's often quite difficult to tell stories which are compelling in that way. So I think it's better not to attach oneself, not to try and find a story, but to be unattached, not detached. We can't be detached from our own sufferings, but non-attached, like it is taught in Buddhism. Can I tell you a story of my own? We'll finish on. It's a true story. I heard about an American student of a Japanese Zen master who went to Japan and meditated sitting for 15 years. And at infrequent, irregular intervals, the master would send him and say, how are you meditating? Carry on, carry on. And so he went on doing this for 15 years. And he then asked to see the master. And the master said to him, well, how are you getting on? And the student said, well, after all these years of sitting here, facing a wall, by the way, every day, getting up at 3 o'clock, physical labor, but otherwise just sitting at the wall, I've found a tiny spot in myself, which is a spot of peace, a tiny spot. And the master said, good, he said. If you can destroy that spot, you can start to meditate. 15 years down the drain.
In order to discover what to destroy.
Yes, yes.
John Gray, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You are a wonderful writer and a wonderful storyteller. I wanted to say speaker, but storyteller, real. We are looking forward to having you just here in Bucharest in order to discuss, I don't know, 2-3 hours, because it's
and
wonderful.
Tell some more stories.
Yes.
Especially funny ones. Thank you very much indeed, all of you.
Thank you very much.